If you're on fighting game Twitter, you'll know that the same topics and discussion pieces have cycled over and over again for near enough a decade now, and it can get pretty boring pretty quick. However, there is one that I find really quite interesting, and it's the great dash button debate. Now, some people might think arguments about dash buttons started with Guilty Gear Strive, but actually it's been about in different forms since as early as the console release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. The discussion around a dash button there is pretty far away from what it is now though, because the conversation centers around the idea of adding it into Street Fighter 6. So instead of tapping forward twice to dash, you just hold a direction and press a button. The topic is actually far more interesting than it initially looks, because as you probably know, we can't just add it into Street Fighter and expect it to be the same game. But what you might not realise is we're actually getting to the point where developers might have to add it. So before we get into this properly, I want to get out of the way a talking point which I hear a lot that I honestly think is the least compelling argument for this edition. Ease of use. It's irrelevant to the actually interesting part of this discussion and to me has no bearing on whether or not we should add it into Street Fighter. Of course, I appreciate the notion of simpler inputs for a new audience, but I personally don't believe that dashing falls into this category due to how easy it is to do. So why is adding a dash button a big deal? Well, it might not be obvious, but it technically changes the speed of dashes. Dashing is easy. You press forward, go to neutral, press forward again. The thing is, you cannot input this instantly. You're not doing an entire input on one frame. If you're using a joystick or arcade stick, there is going to be travel time when moving to and from these directions. To illustrate this, I recorded myself dashing 10 times from neutral in training mode. The average of the 10 landed at 8 frames from the first forward input to the second. Just as a quick note, I've played on arcade stick for 10 years non-stop, and a lot of those games don't have dashes in, but still, I might not have the quickest hands, but I probably represent the average player, maybe slightly above. Ryu's dash is 16 frames, and if we add on the average from our test, it becomes 24. It might not seem like a huge difference, but any extra frames on a move is going to make it more punishable on reaction, or simply increase the chance of you getting hit by a random button put out to take up space, therefore modifying its risk reward. A way people get around this is to buffer a dash behind a quick whiffed button, which does work. It makes it less reactable, but you're still adding vulnerability to the dash. It's not a complete solution. Now if we change this input to a button, it is then 1 frame, removing at best 7 frames of delay. This may seem like a small change, but if you're on an intermediate or high level, you'll know that adjusting the frames on a dash is a huge deal. In Season 1, Charlie's dash was 17 frames, which was considered very strong due to how deceptive the startup was and its speed. In Season 2, it went down to 19 frames, fixing what was considered an imbalance when combined with the change of startup animation. So it's clear that these small amount of frames do matter. If a developer wanted to add a dash button, they'd also need to add in extra startup frames, because God knows you don't want dashes to become completely unreactable or even slightly less reactable without balancing around it. If they were to, the pace of the game would shift, favouring buttons that occupied spaces rather than reactions and favouring rushdown even more. The problem is, this issue is already here, and it's in the form of different controllers. The test we did earlier was on arcade stick, so let's compare that to an all button controller. By double tapping, we're able to get a dash to come out in 6 frames on average out of 10, making it 2 frames quicker than the arcade stick. And for reference, I don't play hitbox at all. Not as commonly used by the average player, but if you use a controller with both an analog stick and a D-pad, you can recreate the same thing by tapping in the same direction with both directional inputs. This is an issue that Takedo recently highlighted and has helped contribute to the rise of button-only controllers. It's quickly distinguishing itself as the optimal way to play fighting games at a competitive level, and there does need to be some work from developers to equal the playing field. If we look at the Japanese Street Fighter scene, or hell, even the Western Street Fighter scene, we're seeing players who have honed their skills on an arcade stick for over 2 decades make the switch due to the advantages, which, don't get me wrong, aren't limited to just dashes. When this discourse of adding a dash button arises, what concerns me is ill-considered macros, because as I've already highlighted, they change the game. X-Men vs Street Fighter is a vast, beautiful game, and one of the reasons it isn't completely out of control is due to how difficult 3-button dash is. It's easy as hell for even veterans of the game to drop a combo requiring a dash. Which sounds crazy, right? We hit 3 buttons at the same time non-stop in modern fighters, but in this game the window for error is absolutely tiny. If you do not trust me, go try it. You throw a dash macro in there and suddenly the game's speed and balance completely changes because the chances to mess up are near enough removed. Despite what your fave might tell you, we can't just get rid of motion inputs, change controller schemes or add macros without real consideration to keep the games playing like we expect. A lot of the foundational best practice for developers is from the arcade era. So when we have modern issues that arise from things like new controllers, we need modern solutions, and a dash button might just be one of them. From little things like time to block from walking to execution, all button controllers are starting to change absolutely everything. If we don't start addressing this, we can end up in a world where fighting games at the highest level of gameplay are gatekept by controller preference, which none of us want. We're certainly not there yet. Pad and arcade stick players are still tearing up the tournament scene, but it could eventually happen if games don't consider this hardware shift properly, and I have no doubt the macros will eventually play a part in this balancing act.